Greetings. This is Dr. Tillman. This is the last video lecture that I will give for the semester, for the spring 2020 semester. This short lecture will complement chapter 28 in terms of political parties and the civil rights movement as well. But I want to expand a little more to talk about Democrats, Republicans, and the rise of the new right. It answers the question of what historical incident had led African Americans to vote overwhelmingly Democrat and Southern whites to vote overwhelmingly Republican. And what is the rising new right? The pictures you see right here are the picture of Fannie Lou Hamer, a member of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in the middle, 1964 Democratic National Convention. The other picture on towards, well, it's my right, which is your left, is Ronald Reagan, a very important figure in the rising new right. And of course, the predecessor of the new right, Barry Goldwater, and his run for president in 1964. Now, in order to understand the switch from left to right, from Democrat to Republican, and understand the constituent that these figures have, you have to understand the political spectrum. Anyone who is taught political science, you're taught that in each political party you have a political spectrum, one towards the left and one towards the right. If you're towards the left, most folks engage in socialism, liberalism, or communism. If you're towards the right, you're mostly engaged in conservatism, libertarianism, or fascism. And in the middle is the moderates. In both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, there are moderates, liberals, and conservatives within these parties. And this is what has played out. Now, to go back to our question, what is it that have led African Americans to vote for the Democratic Party overwhelmingly? Well, first, the major switch will come during the Great Depression era. Now, not all African Americans voted overwhelmingly. These first, only African Americans who can vote outside the Deep South could vote. Number two, the majority of many African Americans, particularly those in large urban areas, voted for Franklin D. Roosevelt because they wanted access to New Deal programs. Now, granted, the New Deal excluded African Americans, particularly in the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the homeowners loan corporation programs had literally redlined black neighborhoods and led to no investment whatsoever. Still, African Americans in the North, were part of a Democratic voting bloc, along with white Southerners, labor union members, women, and others as well. This voting bloc will continue for African Americans to be part of it during Harry S. Truman's tenure as president. Now, in order to, these policies he created, such as the executive order to desegregate the military and to create the civil rights commissions, were not because he was progressive, or even with Roosevelt's New Deal. They did so because, number one, they were pushed in order to do so. And for Harry Truman himself, the Cold War were major issues where America would really to kind of hide America's segregation policies and present this image that America is doing well in its race relations when it wasn't. Nevertheless, these policies that really never were enforced maintain a large voting presence among black people in the African community. Now, within the Democratic Party, you have to look at Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman as being either liberal or moderate Democrats in terms of race relations. Many people call Franklin D. Roosevelt a liberal because of his New Deal policies. Well, in order to maintain those New Deal policies, he had to make negotiations with or work with the conservative wing of the Democratic Party, the Southern Democrats. Now, by 1948, after Harry S. Truman created the Civil Rights Commission and desegregated the military, you begin to see ruptures occur within the Democratic Party. The Southern Democrats, in many cases, many of them would tend to break away from them and create what is called the Dixiecrat Party. In 1948, led by Strom Thurmond. This is pretty much the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. and their constituents were the former Confederate states in both the Upper and the Deep South. Their policies were they were pro-segregationists, and they filibustered every civil rights legislation that they came across either the U.S. Senate or the House of Representatives. And they were also socially conservative. They were mostly anti-immigration. They were not astute on women's rights at all. Matter of fact, they were not in for equal rights for women. They were mostly religious, pretty much Judeo-Christianity conservatives. So this right here, you was begin to see is uh, the predecessor, what we will come known as the Republican Party. Now, you did have black Republicans. On the other side, the Republican Party, even though they had conservative, they're not the conservative Republican Party you see today. Most of them were upper class, pro-business people, um, Wall Street folks who were upscale, upper middle class. These were mostly led by the Tom Dewey and the Nelson Rockefeller types, and they were very moderate and very liberal. In terms of African Americans who were black Republicans, they were mostly different they're mostly different political spectrums. For example, Martin Luther King, you saw, was mostly a liberal Republican. He grew up in the South. He was part of the Deep South. Therefore, the Dixiecrats, who were very conservative, did not allow black people to vote. So, of course, he would associate himself with the Republican Party or a liberal Democratic Party. And also because it was, still part of the Abraham Lincoln Party. Edward Brooke, however, was a very moderate Republican. He helped co-wrote the Civil Rights Act in 1964 with other moderate and liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats as well. But he was also a staunch Cold War advocate. He was very pro-business. He was very conservative when it comes to civil rights, though. He was not. He was always about. He supported the status quo when it comes down to not in terms of letting politics set the tone for displaying civil rights legislation. He did not believe that folks should be pushed, that politicians should be pushed into passing legislation. He was very outspoken against Martin Luther King in many cases in terms of him speaking out against civil rights. Another one was, of course, Jackie Robinson, who was very moderate to being, in many cases, very conservative. Jackie Robinson was, at that time, a Nixon Republican. He supported Richard Nixon, Richard Nixon's ideas. He was a hard, stone cold War advocate, very supportive military, very pro-business. Jackie Robinson was involved in the civil rights, uh, movement as well. But during this time period, a large 25 to 30% of black voters still voted Republican. Many of them voted for the re-election of Eisenhower, President Dwight Eisenhower, mostly because he dispersed the National Guard to protect black students from entering to Central High School, the Central 9 in Little Rock, Arkansas. Not because he was progressive. He didn't want United States, U.S. racism to claim to be projected in the media globally. Now, this right here is part of your lecture, the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party. Those same Southern Dixiecrats, you see like such as Strom Thurmond or other Southern Dixiecrats, were actually challenged by the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party. This was actually created by SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And what happened was, after the death of James Chaney, Jim Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, you begin to see the creation of a independent political party within the Democratic Party itself. And the intent was to unseat the Southern Democrats delegates who were Dixiecrats from the state of Mississippi and the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City in 1964. Now, of course, Lyndon Baines Johnson wanted those Southern votes. Matter of fact, the Democratic Party continued to keep the coalition together of trying to have black voters along with Southern voters. Well, the Civil Rights Movement did not make this out. The Civil Rights Movement itself began to protest and put pressure on the Democratic Party. Well, for the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, they actually presented Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray, and Ann Devine as their delegates, and they wanted them to unseat the delegates, the Dixiecrat delegate there at the convention. What happened was that Lyndon Baines Johnson had struck a deal with members of SNCC and members of and Martin Luther King himself not to seat the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, to keep the Mississippi Dixiecrat delegates there and to seat them in the next presidential national convention. Well, there was a compromise made between the civil rights leaders and the Democratic Party, and this led to a huge split in SNCC, where some actually began to adopt black nationalism. But this right here is what this is very important, because you begin to see the Democratic Party having to make a decision whether or not it will support legislation to deal with civil rights and voting rights for African Americans. And of course, the Civil Rights Act Bill 1964. A Dixiecrat by the name of, or I would say a Southern Democrat by the name of Richard Russell, who was the mentor to Lyndon Baines Johnson, told Lyndon Baines Johnson, if you sign the Civil Rights Act bill, you will hand the entire South over to the Republican Party. And eventually it did. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Civil Rights Act of 1965 led to the Southern Dixiecrats Party, including Strom Thurmond, to leave the Democratic Party and actually invade the Republican Party in 1964. This is the making of what you call many different groups who were Cold War advocates, staunch Republicans, pro-business people. And in 1964, you had the Republican National Convention, where you had Senator Barry Goldwater. And in it, he had his coalition of Southern evangelicals, corporations, and the new right-wing Republicans who were former Dixiecrats, white Southerners, and the John Birch Society. You also had Ku Klux Klan members who openly supported Barry Goldwater. Many of the black moderates were actually expelled or actually kicked out of the Republican Party. Many black Republicans, including Jackie Robinson and Martin Luther King himself, left the Republican Party and overwhelmingly voted Democratic Party. The 1964 Republican National Convention itself was a watershed. This actually led for African Americans in fear to vote for the Democratic Party overwhelmingly in the 70 to 80%. And it led to Southern whites, particularly whites from the Southern, to vote overwhelmingly Republican, 70 to 80%. And of course, these are pictures of black Republicans being expelled, of course, and these are riots. The new right will not come with Richard Nixon, and it will not come with George Wallace. These are very important parts. It will actually come in the 1980s. America becomes overwhelmingly conservative. You will have conservative think tanks who begin to create something called the Heritage Foundation. It's funded by the Adolph Coors Foundation, like Coors Light, Coors Beer, Andrew Mellon, the Carnegie Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. These are huge corporate foundations who now turn out to fund the conservative ideology. You now begin to see the rise of the Christian right, such as Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and of course, you begin to see Phyllis Kafali, who is anti-feminism. The picture you see right here, she spoke out against the equal rights for women. She believed that women should not have no equal rights towards men. You also begin to see the deregulation of corporation and the repealing of Civil Rights Act. This is important because what you really begin to see is the growth and equality between the rich and the poor through these deregulation policies and banks and everything else. And with it, you begin to see the rise of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. These folks become the pictures of the new right. And many of these ideals that you see is still expressed till this very day. This is the reason why the majority of Southerners, white Southerners, vote Republican, and the majority of African Americans actually vote Democrats. And my time is up. I will conclude this lecture. I will answer all questions during the Zoom video chat.